My name is Thaddeus Wainwright. I was the agricultural director at Stillwater Correctional when the soil fungus destroyed our food supply. The prison riot was just the beginning. For 30 days, I fought to survive the dust apocalypse while searching for my daughter across a dying landscape. My seed collection might save humanity, but only if I can stay alive long enough. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I still remember exactly how it started. Most people think the dust apocalypse happened overnight, but that's not true. There were signs for months before everything fell apart. I just didn't want to see them. None of us did. My name is Thaddeus Wainwright. Everyone called me Thad. I was the agricultural director at Stillwater Correctional Facility in Minnesota. Not the kind of job most people think about when they imagine prison work. I wasn't a guard or a warden. I ran the prison farm program, taught inmates how to grow food, manage livestock, create sustainable systems. It was rehabilitation through agriculture. The prison was almost self-sufficient. We grew most of our own vegetables, had dairy cows, chickens, the works. The day before everything changed was so normal it hurts to think about now. April 15th. Tax Day. The irony isn't lost on me that society started collapsing on the day we were all supposed to pay our dues to keep it running. I arrived at the facility at 6 in the morning like I always did. The sunrise was perfect that day. All pinks and oranges across the flat Minnesota landscape. The prison sat on 800 acres, most of it farmland. From the parking lot, you couldn't even see the fences and guard towers in the distance. Just fields waiting for the spring planting. Johnson, one of my inmate crew leaders, met me at the agricultural building. He was serving 15 years, but had become my right hand in the program. "Morning, Mr. Wainwright," he said. "Got those soil reports you wanted?" I remember the weight of that manila folder in my hands. If I'd known what was in it, maybe I would have thrown it away, driven home, packed up, and headed for the mountains. But I just thanked him and set it on my desk to look at later. We did our usual morning rounds, checked the greenhouse tomatoes which were coming in beautifully, fed the livestock, assigned work details to the 36 inmates in my program. Everything seemed fine on the surface, but looking back, I should have noticed the little things. The winter wheat we'd planted in our test plot was growing unevenly. Some areas lush and green, others stunted and yellowish. I made a note to check the irrigation system, thinking it was just uneven water distribution. There were fewer birds than usual, too. The red-winged blackbirds that normally nested in the wetland area along the north property line were gone. So were the killdeer that usually darted through our fields. At the time, I blamed it on the unusually warm spring. Maybe they just moved on early. Around 10 o'clock, I got a call from Dr. Eliza Chen at the State Agricultural Extension Office. We'd been friends since college, both studied sustainable agriculture at the University of Minnesota. "Thad," she said, "have you been seeing any unusual growth patterns in your cereal crops?" I told her about the winter wheat, how some patches were thriving while others looked sickly. "We're seeing it all over," she said. "Rice County, Blue Earth County, even up in St. Louis County. The lab is backed up with soil samples. Can you send me some from your affected areas?" I promised her I would, and hung up. Still didn't think it was anything serious. Crop diseases happen all the time. That's why we have agricultural scientists and extension offices. At lunch, I finally opened that soil report Johnson had given me. The results were strange. Nutrient levels were normal, pH was normal, but there was an unidentified organic component that had increased 340% from our January testing. The lab couldn't identify it, had marked it for further analysis. I should have connected this to what Eliza was saying, but I didn't. Not yet. That afternoon, I had a meeting with Warden Phillips about expanding the agriculture program. The prison system was looking at budget cuts, and our farm program saved Stillwater almost $400,000 annually in food costs. He wanted to know if we could produce more. With more land and more inmates in the program, absolutely, I told him. But we'd need to invest in better irrigation and maybe a second greenhouse. He nodded, making notes. Food security is becoming a priority for the Department of Corrections, he said. There's talk about nationwide crop issues. Nothing serious yet, but they want all facilities to increase self-sufficiency. Another warning sign I missed. Why would prison administrators suddenly care about food security unless they knew something the public didn't? After work, I drove home to my small farmhouse about 20 miles from the prison. I'd bought it after my divorce 5 years ago. 3 acres, most of which I'd converted to a test garden for heritage vegetables and rare grain varieties. My personal passion was seed preservation. I had a climate-controlled room in my basement with hundreds of varieties of seeds, carefully stored in airtight containers. I tried calling my daughter that night. Madison was 19, studying environmental science at the University of Washington. Things had been strained between us since the divorce. She blamed me for choosing my work over her mother. There's truth in that. I worked 60-hour weeks, came home exhausted, barely had anything left for my family. The call went to voicemail. "Hey, Maddie, it's Dad. Just checking in. Love you." The same message I'd left a dozen times before. I ate dinner alone, watching the news. There was a small segment about crop failures in California's Central Valley. The reporter standing in front of withered tomato plants, farmers worrying about their livelihood. Nobody mentioned why it was happening. Just drought, climate change, the usual suspects. Before bed, I went down to my seed vault. It was my nightly ritual. I checked the temperature and humidity meters, sometimes just stand there looking at the shelves of carefully labeled containers. Seeds from 6 continents. Some varieties that barely existed anymore outside of collections like mine. I didn't know it then, but this hobby would soon become the most important thing I'd ever done. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something about the soil report kept nagging at me. At 2 a.m, I got up and sent an email to Eliza with the report attached. "Does this unknown organic compound match what you're seeing elsewhere?" I asked. The next morning, I woke to her reply, "Yes. Come to the office immediately. Don't discuss with anyone." I never made it to her office. By the time I reached the prison for my morning shift, everything had already started to unravel. The cafeteria was serving protein substitute instead of real meat, and someone had posted the memo about food substitutions where inmates could see it. The first riot broke out during breakfast. By lunch, the entire prison was on lockdown. I remember standing in Warden Phillips's office, watching the security feed as inmates overturned tables, fought with guards. Blood on the linoleum floor of a place I'd walked through every day for 8 years. "Tell me the truth," Phillips said, his face ashen. "How bad is this going to get?" I thought about the soil reports, the missing birds, the withered wheat, Eliza's urgent message. "I think we need to prepare for the worst," I said. "If it's what I suspect, a soil-borne pathogen, we could be looking at widespread crop failure. Not just here, everywhere." He slumped in his chair. "The department sent orders this morning. We're to inventory all food supplies and prepare rationing protocols. They're talking about releasing non-violent offenders if the situation deteriorates." That's when I knew. This wasn't just another agricultural challenge to overcome. This was the beginning of something none of us were prepared for. The warden looked up at me, his eyes hollow. "Your farm program. Can it sustain us?" I thought about lying. It would have been easier, but I couldn't. Number, if the soil is infected, nothing will grow. Not for years, maybe longer. He nodded slowly. Then God help us all. I left his office and walked straight to the greenhouse. My tomatoes were still green and vibrant under the grow lights. I ran my fingers along the leaves, knowing they might be the last healthy plants I'd touch for a very long time. The first true panic hit the prison cafeteria on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesday was always meatloaf day, except there wasn't any meat anymore. Not real meat, anyway. We'd been serving protein substitute for 3 weeks already, but the inmates didn't know that. Until some genius from the Department of Corrections sent a memo about alternative nutrition sources that got posted in the wrong staff area. I was inspecting the greenhouse tomatoes when the alarm sounded. By the time I reached the main building, 2 guards were down and Warden Phillips was bleeding from a gash above his eye. The cafeteria looked like a war zone. Overturned tables, shattered trays, and 37 angry men who'd just realized exactly how bad things were getting outside. "Wainwright," Phillips shouted when he spotted me. "Tell them about the farm program. Tell them we'll be self-sufficient." I looked at the desperate faces around me, men who understood confinement and scarcity better than most, and knew I couldn't lie. Not about this. "The soil samples came back yesterday," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos. "Our ground's contaminated too. 6 months, maybe less, before total crop failure." The silence that followed was worse than the riot. In that moment, we all understood the same truth. The prison walls that had kept these men in would soon be the only thing keeping others out. Johnson was the first to speak up. "What about the greenhouse crops?" "Safe for now," I told him, "but we need to test them daily. The pathogen is spreading faster than anyone predicted." That afternoon, the warden called an emergency staff meeting. The National Guard had been deployed to major cities. Food riots had broken out in Chicago, Detroit, Minneapolis. The prison system was implementing strict rationing, effective immediately. "Half portions for inmates, 3/4 portions for staff," the warden announced. "Stillwater has been designated a secure food storage facility. We'll be receiving shipments from federal reserves within the week." One of the guards laughed bitterly. "So, we're going to sit on stockpiles while people starve outside? How long before they come knocking?" The warden didn't answer. He didn't need to. We all knew our remote location was precisely why Stillwater had been chosen. Far enough from population centers to avoid immediate targeting, close enough to be strategic. After the meeting, I stayed behind with Phillips. "We need to increase greenhouse production," I told him. "Hydroponic systems don't use soil. We could convert the workshops, the gym, even the chapel." Phillips nodded, rubbing his bandaged forehead. "Do it. Whatever you need. Just keep it quiet until we're ready to announce it." For the next week, I worked 18-hour days with my inmate crew. We dismantled weight benches and basketball hoops, repurposed fluorescent lights, created growing chambers from plastic sheeting and PVC pipe. Johnson proved invaluable, organizing the men, keeping them focused despite the growing fear. "My kid sister lives in St. Paul," he told me one night as we installed irrigation lines. "You think the cities are as bad as they say?" "Worse," I admitted. "The supply chains were already fragile before this hit. Now, with the soil contamination spreading, everyone's panicking." The next morning, the first National Guard trucks arrived. Not with food, but with more prisoners. Overflow from county jails being consolidated to free up personnel for civil defense. The newcomers brought stories from outside that made even the hardened Stillwater inmates fall silent. Supermarkets with empty shelves and armed guards at the doors. Hospitals overwhelmed with people showing symptoms of the dust-borne pathogen, which had mutated to affect humans with respiratory problems. Military checkpoints on major highways. turning back refugees from more severely affected regions. One of the new arrivals was a former agriculture professor who recognized me from a conference years ago. While the others were being processed, he pulled me aside. "Wainwright, they're lying about the containment," he whispered. "This thing isn't just in the soil anymore. It's airborne. The spores can travel for miles. They're calling it rust dust now." I thought about my greenhouse projects, the careful isolation protocols we'd implemented. "How long do we have?" He shook his head. "Hard to say. But I've seen the projections. 80% crop failure globally within 12 months. Existing food reserves will last 6 months at most. After that," he didn't finish. He didn't need to. That night, I made my first inventory of the seed vault in my office. Heritage varieties, drought-resistant strains, plants that could grow in marginal conditions. I'd been collecting them for the prison program for years. Now they might be worth more than gold. The television in the staff lounge was showing footage of military vehicles rolling through downtown Minneapolis. The president had addressed the nation, declaring a state of emergency, promising that research teams were working around the clock to find a solution to the soil pathogen. "The American people have faced challenges before," she said, her face grave. "We will overcome this one as well. In the meantime, I ask for your patience and cooperation with the necessary measures being implemented for everyone's safety." No one in the room believed her. We'd seen the soil test results. We knew what was coming. 2 days later, the first dust storm hit. I was outside with Johnson, harvesting the last of our field crops before they failed completely. The sky turned the color of rust, and the wind carried particles that stung our eyes and throats. "Get inside," I shouted, pulling my shirt over my mouth. "Don't breathe it in." We ran for the agricultural building, sealing the doors behind us. Through the windows, we watched the red-tinged dust settle on everything, a fine powder that would kill any plant it touched. That evening, Warden Phillips received new orders from the Department of Corrections. Non-violent offenders were to be released immediately to reduce the strain on resources. "They're throwing them out to die," Johnson said when I told him. His sentence had 6 more years, but as a drug offender, he'd be among those released. "I'm sending you with supplies," I told him. "Seeds, instructions for building basic hydroponic systems. Head north if you can. The pathogen doesn't seem to spread as well in colder climates." Johnson studied my face. "You're not planning to stay, are you? This place is going to fall apart once the releases start." He was right. The prison ecosystem depended on a delicate balance of routine and authority. With half the population suddenly gone and resources dwindling, that balance would shatter. "I have to find my daughter," I said. "She's in Washington State. Last I heard, the West Coast was doing better than we are here." "The roads will be chaos," he warned. "Military blockades, desperate people. I'll manage." I handed him a small packet of seeds, carefully wrapped in waterproof material. "Take these, northern wild rice. It can grow in water with minimal soil contact. Might be resistant to the pathogen." He tucked the packet into his shoe. "What about your collection?" "The one you keep talking about at your house." "That's my first stop after I leave here," I said. "I'm not leaving those seeds behind." As I watched the dust accumulate outside, coating the prison yard in a film of rusty death, I knew my time at Stillwater was coming to an end. 30 days. That's how long I gave myself to get to Madison. 30 days to travel across a country descending into chaos, carrying the most valuable thing left in the world, the means to grow food again someday. The mass release of prisoners began 3 days after that first dust storm. I stood at the main gate watching buses load up with men who looked more terrified of freedom than they ever had of incarceration. Johnson was among the last group. He'd been with my agricultural program for 6 years, and knew more about sustainable growing systems than most college graduates. "Take the back roads north," I told him, pressing a hand-drawn map into his palm along with the packet of wild rice seeds. "The National Guard is blocking the highways. Find water, river systems, lakes. The pathogen doesn't spread as easily there." He nodded, clutching the small bag of supplies the prison had provided each releasee. 3 days of rations, a bottle of water, and a face mask that would be useless against the microscopic fungal spores. "What about you, Mr. Wainwright? When are you heading out?" "Tomorrow," I said. "I need to secure my seed collection first." Johnson glanced at the guards, then lowered his voice. "Word is they're converting this place into a government food repository. Military's bringing in supplies, planning to hunker down." That confirmed my suspicions. Stillwater's remote location made it perfect for long-term storage away from desperate urban populations. I'd seen the reinforcements arriving, the new security protocols, the inventory lists that suddenly excluded staff from certain storage areas. "Be careful out there," Johnson said as the guards called his name for boarding. "And if you find your daughter, tell her she had a good dad." Had, past tense. That's when it hit me how truly bad things were. Even the prisoners assumed most of us wouldn't survive what was coming. After the buses left, Warden Phillips called the remaining staff together. Half our colleagues had already abandoned their posts, rushing home to their families as news of the spreading contamination worsened. Those of us left were either single, estranged, or too dedicated to our jobs to leave. "From this point forward, Stillwater is operating under direct federal authority," Phillips announced. "The facility will serve as a secure distribution center for the region. New security protocols are effective immediately." He outlined the changes: armed patrols along the perimeter, restricted access to food storage areas, mandatory health screenings, and, most significantly, no one would be permitted to leave the facility without federal clearance. I raised my hand. "Some of us have family we need to check on." Phillips looked at me with something like pity. "I understand, Wainwright, but the roads aren't safe, and frankly, we need your expertise here." I nodded as if accepting this, but my mind was already calculating. The fence had blind spots near the old East Field. The security cameras there had been malfunctioning for months, and with the staffing shortage, the patrols would be thin. That night, I packed my essentials into a backpack: water purification tablets, a first aid kit, a hunting knife I kept in my office, and several changes of clothes. I wrote detailed instructions for maintaining the greenhouse systems and left them on my desk. Someone might be able to use them after I was gone. At 3 in the morning, I made my move. The night was moonless, the air heavy with dust particles that reflected the security lights in an eerie red glow. I'd mapped the patrol schedules, knew I had exactly 7 minutes between rounds. The old drainage ditch under the east fence hadn't been properly secured in years. I slipped through, mud caking my clothes, and disappeared into the woods beyond the prison farm. By dawn, I'd hiked 8 miles to the small town where I'd parked my truck the day before, claiming a family emergency. The streets were deserted except for a military Humvee parked outside the grocery store. I kept to backyards and alleyways until I reached the municipal lot. My truck started on the first try, a small mercy I hadn't counted on. The gas gauge showed 3/4 full, another stroke of luck. I'd need every drop to reach my house and then head west toward Washington. The road home was like driving through an apocalyptic movie. Abandoned cars lined the highway shoulders. A gas station was surrounded by desperate people trying to siphon the last fuel from underground tanks. Military checkpoints had been established at major intersections, but they were only checking vehicles heading toward population centers, not away from them. My farmhouse looked untouched when I arrived, standing alone among fields that were already showing signs of the contamination. The winter wheat I'd planted as ground cover was turning a sickly yellow-brown at the edges. In another week, it would be completely dead. I went straight to the basement, to my climate-controlled seed vault. The power was still on, a relief since the cooling system was essential for seed viability. My collection represented years of work: heirloom vegetables, ancient grain varieties, medicinal herbs, plants that could survive in extreme conditions. 342 varieties in total, each carefully labeled and sealed in airtight containers. I couldn't take them all. That was the brutal math of survival. I selected the most important: quinoa that could grow at high altitudes, drought-resistant corn, beans that fixed nitrogen in depleted soil, squash varieties that produced high caloric yield, medicinal plants with antibacterial properties. I removed the seeds from their containers and sewed them into the lining of my jacket, distributing the weight evenly. As I worked, I tried calling Madison again. All circuits were busy, as they had been for days. I'd have to find her the hard way by traveling to her last known location and hoping she'd left some trail to follow. Upstairs, I gathered more supplies: a solar charger for my phone, a detailed road atlas, matches, rope, fishing line, and a small tent. Food was the hardest decision. I had about a week's worth of non-perishables, but I'd need more for the journey ahead. I settled on rice, dried beans, jerky, and powdered milk. Protein and carbohydrates to keep me going. The last thing I took was the photo of Madison from my bedside table. She was 16 in the picture, standing next to a hydroponic lettuce system she'd built for the state science fair. Her smile was radiant, so proud of creating something that could feed people sustainably. I tucked the picture into my breast pocket, right next to the most precious seeds. Before leaving, I wrote a letter explaining where I'd gone and what I knew about the fungal pathogen. I left it on the kitchen table along with half my seed collection and detailed growing instructions. If anyone found this place, at least they'd have a fighting chance. As I loaded my truck, I noticed movement across the field. My nearest neighbor, an elderly man named Frank, who'd farmed the same 100 acres for 60 years, was watching me from his porch. I walked over, keeping a respectful distance. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. "Heading west to find my daughter," I told him. He nodded slowly, his weathered face impassive. "Roads are bad. Military's setting up blockades on the interstates. I'll take back roads." Frank disappeared inside briefly, then returned with an old lever-action rifle and a box of ammunition. "My hunting days are done," he said, holding them out. "Better you have these than me." I started to protest, but the look in his eyes stopped me. This was an old farmer's way of saying goodbye. "The soil will recover," I told him, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "Maybe not for years, but eventually." "Not in my lifetime," he said, "but maybe in your daughter's." I took the rifle, checked that it was unloaded, and secured it in my truck along with the ammunition. It wasn't the kind of protection I'd hoped to rely on, but the world had changed. The rules had changed with it. As I drove away from the only real home I'd known since my divorce, I watched Frank in my rearview mirror, standing alone on his porch as dust began to swirl around him. Another storm was coming. I hoped he'd make it inside in time. The last view of Stillwater Correctional was from a hilltop 5 miles away. From that distance, it looked untouched by the chaos spreading across the country. Its walls still stood firm, its guard towers vigilant. But I knew the truth. Nothing was secure anymore. Not even prisons, especially not prisons. With a full tank of gas, a truck loaded with survival gear, and the most valuable collection of seeds in Minnesota sewn into my jacket, I pointed west and pressed the accelerator. 30 days to cross a collapsing country. 30 days to find Madison before the world completely fell apart. The highways were death traps. I learned that lesson on my first day heading west. Interstate 94 was gridlocked with abandoned vehicles, military checkpoints, and desperate people trying to flee the cities. I made it only 15 miles before turning back, finding myself trapped between a National Guard roadblock and a miles-long traffic jam. That's when I remembered Johnson's advice. Take the back roads. The red roads, as travelers were starting to call them, marked with improvised symbols to indicate safer passage. Not red because they were dangerous, but because they were dusted with the rusty fungal spores yet still navigable. The invisible killer that was destroying our food supply had become a macabre navigational system. I retreated to county roads, then to farm access routes I'd only known from agricultural maps. Minnesota's rural landscape became my highway. I passed small towns that were either completely abandoned or transformed into armed camps. Makeshift barriers across main streets, sentries with hunting rifles, hand-painted signs warning outsiders to keep moving. The dust storms were getting worse. 3 times that first day I had to pull over and wait out swirling clouds of reddish-brown particles that reduced visibility to 0. I used an old bandana as a mask, but I could still taste the metallic tang of the spores. They said the fungus couldn't harm humans directly, but I wasn't taking chances. I'd seen what it did to plants, turning healthy crops to withered husks within days. That night, I slept in my truck at an abandoned rest stop, the rifle Frank had given me across my lap. I was awakened at dawn by the sound of vehicles. A convoy of 3 pickup trucks pulled in, their beds covered with tarps. I tensed, hand on the rifle, but didn't raise it. A woman approached my truck, hands visible, no weapons. "You heading west?" she called. I nodded, window cracked just enough to speak through. "We've got a route mapped to the South Dakota border. Military's got the main crossings blocked, but there's farmland that straddles the state line. No checkpoints." I studied her face, looking for signs of deception. "Why tell me?" "Safety in numbers," she said simply. "And we could use someone who knows agriculture. That jacket you're wearing, the way it's sewn. You're carrying seeds, aren't you?" My hand instinctively touched the jacket where heritage corn seeds were hidden in the lining. "I worked at Stillwater Correctional, agricultural program." Her eyes widened slightly. "Then you've seen the soil tests. You know how bad this really is." "I do." She extended her hand through the window crack. "Liv Pearson. We were small-scale organic farmers before this happened. Now we're just trying to reach the mountains. Higher elevations seem to slow the spread." I introduced myself and agreed to join their convoy. Safety in numbers, as she said. And they had information about the roads ahead that I desperately needed. The group consisted of 3 families, 11 people total. Liv and her husband Dan, their teenage sons. The Kim family with young twin daughters. And the Rodriguezes, an older couple traveling with their adult son who had some kind of developmental disability. Each vehicle was loaded with supplies, and they traveled with discipline, maintaining radio contact and precise following distances. "We mark the safe routes for others," Dan explained as we traveled. "Red chalk on fence posts or road signs. R for Red Road. It's becoming a system. Travelers helping travelers." That day, we covered nearly 200 miles, more than I could have managed alone. We avoided a military blockade by detouring through a network of farm access roads. Twice, we encountered other groups of travelers who shared intelligence about conditions ahead. A handwritten note pinned to a bulletin board outside an abandoned gas station warned of armed looters near the town of Marshall. We diverted north to avoid them. The landscape changed gradually as we moved west. More open, less forested. The farmland showed the advancing stages of the contamination. Fields that should have been lush with early crops were barren or spotted with sickly plants. No farmers in sight. No tractors working the land, just empty silos and silent barns. Did you see any signs of alternative growing systems at Stillwater? Liv asked me during a brief stop. Hydroponics? Aeroponics? Anything soil-free? We were converting every available space, I told her, but it wouldn't have been enough. Not for a facility that size. She nodded grimly. That's what we figured. Soil-free systems can work, but the scale is the problem. Can't feed billions that way, at least not with current technology. Around midday, we encountered our first dust storm of truly frightening proportions. A wall of reddish-brown cloud extending from ground to sky, advancing across the prairie like a slow-motion tsunami. We had no choice but to drive straight into it, windows sealed, vents closed, bandanas over our faces. Visibility dropped to mere feet. The dust infiltrated every crack in the vehicles, despite our precautions. After an hour of crawling progress, we emerged on the other side, our vehicles coated in a layer of rusty powder that I knew contained millions of fungal spores. We stopped at a creek to wash what we could from the exteriors, careful not to let the runoff touch bare skin. That evening, camped in an abandoned barn, I examined my map by flashlight while the others prepared a communal meal. South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, Washington. Each state a barrier between me and Madison. Each with its own checkpoints, dangers, failing infrastructure. You said your daughter's in Washington? Liv asked, sitting beside me. University student, right? I nodded. Environmental science at UW. We haven't spoken much lately. Family issues. The West Coast was hit later than the Midwest, she offered. They might have had time to prepare, set up quarantine zones for their agricultural areas. It was a thin hope, but I clung to it. Any word on communications, phone networks, internet? Spotty at best. Militaries prioritizing their channels. Civilian networks are overwhelmed or failing as power grids become unstable. She hesitated. There's a rumor about radio operators setting up emergency communication relays. Ham radio enthusiasts. They're trying to connect families. The next morning, as we prepared to move out, Dan pulled me aside. There's something you should know, he said quietly. We've heard from other travelers that people with agricultural knowledge are being detained. Detained? By who? Government, military, whoever's in charge now. They're gathering experts, taking them to research facilities. Not by force exactly, but strongly encouraged. His expression was grim. Your background at Stillwater, your knowledge, it makes you valuable. And valuable people don't always get choices anymore. I thought about the seeds sewn into my jacket. If authorities knew what I carried, I'd certainly be detained, my collection confiscated for official use. I thanked Dan for the warning. As we crossed into South Dakota that afternoon, we saw the first sign that gave me real hope. Spray painted on an old barn, Madison's List, Fort Collins. Below it was a crude symbol of a seedling. What's Madison's List? I asked Liv. Her expression brightened. It's new, started by college students, we think. They're compiling names of survivors, trying to help families reconnect. Fort Collins must be a collection point for their information. My heart raced. Madison. It couldn't be a coincidence. My Madison, starting a survivor registry with her environmental science knowledge. It sounded exactly like something she would do. Fort Collins, Colorado was hundreds of miles south of my planned route, but suddenly my destination had changed. If there was even a chance my daughter was there, or information about her, I had to go. That night, I made a difficult decision. I told Liv and Dan I would be leaving their convoy in the morning, heading south instead of continuing west. That's risky, Dan warned. Colorado's enforcing strict border control. Food riots in Denver last week. I have to try, I said. If it's her, if she's alive and helping people. Liv squeezed my arm. We understand. Family comes first. She tore a page from her notebook and drew a map. Take this route. It's longer but avoids the major checkpoints. And use the red road markings. They'll keep you safer. As I settled into my sleeping bag that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced since leaving Stillwater. Hope. Not just for my own survival, but for finding Madison, for reconnecting with my daughter in this broken world. If she was creating a system to reunite families, perhaps she was also looking for me. The seed packets rustled softly in my jacket as I shifted. Tomorrow, I would leave the relative safety of the convoy and strike out alone again, carrying my precious cargo toward a new destination. South, not west, toward a name painted on a barn that might be nothing more than coincidence, but felt like destiny. I never made it to Fort Collins. 3 days into my journey south, I encountered a roadblock that changed everything. Not military or police, but civilians. Local farmers who had established a perimeter around what they were calling the orchard, one of the few productive agricultural areas left in the region. They were suspicious at first, rifles raised as I approached with my hands visible through the driver's side window. A woman who introduced herself as Eleanor Voss asked the questions: where I was coming from, where I was headed, what my business was. When I mentioned my background in prison agriculture and my search for Madison's List, her demeanor changed. "You've worked with controlled growing environments?" she asked, suddenly interested. I nodded. 8 years at Stillwater. We were converting to hydroponic systems when everything fell apart. She conferred briefly with the others, then turned back to me. "We could use someone with your expertise. We've got apple orchards that are somehow resisting the contamination, but we don't understand why. Our soil scientist died 2 weeks ago during a supply run." "I'm looking for my daughter," I explained. "Madison's List might help me find her." Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "Madison's List is a registry system, but the collection points keep moving as areas become unsafe. Fort Collins was evacuated 3 days ago after dust storms contaminated their water supply. Their registry data was reportedly moved to Sheridan, Wyoming." My heart sank. Another redirect. Another 100 miles of dangerous travel. "Stay with us for a few days," she offered. "Help us understand why our orchards are surviving. We have radio operators who monitor emergency frequencies. If Madison's List broadcasts new information, we'll hear it." I wanted to keep moving, but my fuel was running low, and the promise of a relatively safe place to rest was tempting. I agreed to stay for 3 days, no more. The orchard turned out to be a 500-acre apple farming operation nestled in a small valley. The owners had died early in the crisis, and Eleanor, who had been their farm manager, had organized the neighboring families into a cooperative community. They'd erected barriers, established security rotations, and most importantly, maintained the orchard through the initial waves of contamination. "We don't know why the trees are still producing," Eleanor explained as she showed me around. "The soil tests positive for the fungal pathogen, but the apples are clean and healthy. We've got about 60 people living here now, most of them refugees from nearby towns." The community had converted the main barn into a dormitory, the old farmhouse into a communal kitchen and meeting space. They'd established rain catchment systems, solar panels salvaged from abandoned homes, and a strict protocol for checking harvested apples for contamination. They assigned me a small room in what had once been the farm's office building and provided a hot meal, my first in days. The simple luxury of sitting at a table, eating food that wasn't from a can, surrounded by people who weren't eyeing each other suspiciously, felt almost surreal. That night I met with their council, 5 people elected by the community to make decisions. Eleanor was their leader, a former agricultural extension agent named Miguel, their head of food production, an ex-military woman called Sergeant Ross handled security, a retired doctor named Williams managed health issues, and a young schoolteacher named Claire organized labor and education. "We've got enough apples stored to last through winter," Miguel explained, "but we need diversification. Other food sources." I thought about the seeds sown into my jacket lining. Heritage varieties that could establish new food systems. I'd been saving them for Madison, for wherever we ended up, but these people needed help now. "I might have something that could help," I said carefully, "but I need to know this place is secure, that you're not just hoarding resources while others starve." Sergeant Ross bristled at the implication, but Eleanor raised a hand to calm her. "Fair concern. We take in people who can contribute. We trade apples with neighboring communities for supplies we can't produce. We're not fortress hoarders, Mr. Wainwright. We're trying to rebuild." Over the next few days, I worked with Miguel to understand the orchard's mysterious resilience. The answer, when we found it, was surprisingly simple: mycorrhizal fungi. The previous owners had been early adopters of beneficial fungal networks that helped their trees absorb nutrients. This established fungal network was somehow preventing the pathogenic fungi from colonizing the tree's root systems. It wasn't a miracle cure for all agriculture. The beneficial fungi were specific to woody perennials like apple trees. But it was hope. The first real, scientific hope I'd encountered since fleeing Stillwater. By my third day, I'd made a decision. I revealed my seed collection to the council, spreading out small packets on the farmhouse table. Quinoa, amaranth, beans, specialized corn varieties, medicinal herbs. "These are heritage seeds," I explained. "Plants bred for resilience, nutrition, and adaptation to difficult growing conditions. If we establish greenhouse systems using uncontaminated growing medium, we could start diversifying your food supply within months." The council was stunned into silence. In the new world, my collection represented incalculable wealth. "Why would you share this with us?" Claire finally asked. "You don't know us." "Because knowledge does no good if it dies with me," I answered. "And because I need help finding my daughter." Two-way radios, information networks, people who might have heard of Madison's list moving beyond Sheridan. The next morning, the community gathered to vote on whether to allocate resources to build the greenhouse systems I'd designed. The vote was unanimous in favor. We began work that afternoon, repurposing an old equipment shed, using plastic sheeting, PVC pipe, and salvaged materials. I found unexpected allies among the community members. A former plumber who understood water distribution systems. A carpenter who could adapt my sketched plans into functional structures. Even children who carefully sorted tiny seeds into growing trays under Claire's supervision. A week passed, then 2. I kept telling myself I would leave tomorrow, continue my search for Madison. But each day brought progress that was hard to walk away from. The first seedlings emerging, the expansion of our growing area, the careful experiments with mycorrhizal fungi applications to container plants. The outside world continued to deteriorate. Refugees brought news of cities completely abandoned, of military forces consolidating around strategic resources, of dust storms that now carried not just fungal spores, but the ashes of forest fires that had begun to rage unchecked. On my 18th day at the orchard, our peaceful existence was shattered. I was working in the greenhouse when the alarm sounded. 3 short blasts of an air horn, the signal for an approaching threat. Sergeant Ross organized the defense. Armed residents took positions along the perimeter while non-combatants moved to designated shelter areas. I grabbed the rifle Frank had given me and joined a group covering the main entrance. A convoy of 5 vehicles approached the barrier. 3 pickup trucks, a delivery van, and a school bus with blacked-out windows. They stopped 50 yards from our blockade. A man stepped out of the lead truck, hands raised. "We know you have food," he shouted. "We have wounded, children. We just want to trade." Sergeant Ross used a bullhorn to respond. "What do you have to offer?" "Fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, and information." That last word caught my attention. I moved closer to Eleanor. "Ask them about Madison's list." She nodded and relayed the question to Ross, who called out, "What do you know about Madison's list?" The man's posture changed slightly. "We have a coordinator with us, registry data from 6 states, but we don't share that until we're inside your perimeter. It could be a trap, or it could be my best chance yet to find information about Madison." I looked at Eleanor, torn between caution and desperate hope. "We need to be careful," she said quietly. "But if they truly have Madison's list data, it could help more than just you. Many here have lost contact with family members." As the council debated how to proceed, I watched the convoy, studying their vehicles, the body language of the visible occupants. Something felt wrong. The school bus windows weren't just covered, they were reinforced. The drivers hadn't shut off their engines. And now I noticed people moving into positions around their vehicles, too organized to be frightened refugees. "It's an ambush," I whispered to Eleanor. "They're using Madison's list as bait. Get everyone back." The attack on the orchard came with shocking speed. As soon as Eleanor gave the signal to fall back, the convoy erupted into action. Armed figures poured from the vehicles, using the school bus as a mobile barricade. What looked like homemade smoke bombs arced over our defenses, creating confusion as gunfire erupted. I pulled Eleanor behind an overturned tractor as bullets struck the dirt around us. "These aren't desperate refugees," I shouted. "They're organized raiders." Sergeant Ross coordinated our defense with military precision, but we were outgunned and taken by surprise. 3 of our people went down in the first volley. The attackers advanced methodically, clearly experienced in these kinds of assaults. I had faced prison riots before, but nothing like this coordinated violence. Still, years of crisis management in a correctional setting had taught me to think clearly under pressure. I noticed the raiders were avoiding damage to the greenhouse and orchard storage buildings. They wanted our food production intact. "They're trying to take the place, not destroy it," I told Ross when we regrouped behind the main barn. "They mentioned Madison's list to keep us talking, but they've done this before." She nodded grimly. "We need to reach the emergency supplies. Root cellar under the farmhouse." The farmhouse was 50 yards away across open ground now controlled by the raiders. Impossible to reach directly. But I knew another way. "The irrigation tunnels," I said. "They run from the pump house to the main fields, passing near the farmhouse foundation." The tunnels were barely 4 feet high, designed for maintenance access to the underground pipes that fed the orchard's drip systems. I led Ross and 2 others through the cramped passage, emerging through an access hatch into the farmhouse cellar just as we heard footsteps above us. The raiders had reached the house. In the cellar, Ross quickly distributed the emergency supplies, additional weapons, handheld radios, and most importantly, the seed bank I had helped establish. Hundreds of carefully labeled packets containing the future of the orchard's food security. "They can't get these," I said, stuffing packets into my pockets. "Without genetic diversity, this place has no future." We heard shouting upstairs, furniture being overturned. They were searching methodically. "There's another way out," Ross whispered. "Old root cellar tunnel leads to the apple storage building. We dug it out last winter." We crawled through the narrow passage just as the cellar door splintered open behind us. Emerging in the apple storage facility, we found other community members who had retreated there, including Miguel and Claire with a group of children. "They've taken the main compound," Miguel reported, "at least 30 armed raiders. Professional equipment. They're securing the greenhouse now." Eleanor joined us minutes later, blood streaking her face from a scalp wound. They're calling themselves the Harvesters. They move from community to community, taking over productive agricultural areas. They leave just enough original residents alive to maintain the operations. The brutal logic made a terrible kind of sense in this new world. Why struggle to create food production when you could simply seize it with superior force? We spent that night hidden in the far corner of the apple storage facility, a reinforced concrete building dug into the hillside. 23 survivors from our community of 60. The rest were either captured, fled into the surrounding countryside, or dead. "What about the seeds?" Eleanor asked me quietly. I patted my jacket. "I have the most critical varieties here. The rest are distributed among us. Even if some of us don't make it, the genetic material will survive." That had been my plan from the beginning with my personal collection. Redundancy. Never keeping all the precious seeds in one place or with one person. As midnight approached, I made a difficult decision. "I need to get to the greenhouse," I told the others. "There's something there the raiders don't know about." 2 weeks earlier, when we'd established our first successful growing trays, I had created a hidden compartment beneath the main workbench. Inside were the most valuable seeds from my original collection: disease-resistant potatoes, drought-tolerant wheat, nitrogen-fixing legumes, varieties that could form the foundation of a rebuilt food system. Ross shook her head. "Too dangerous. They've got guards posted." "I worked in a prison for 8 years, I reminded her. "I know how to move undetected in secured areas." Eleanor studied my face. "This isn't just about seeds, is it?" She was right. During the attack, I'd spotted something that made my blood run cold. One of the raiders had been wearing a University of Washington sweatshirt, the same school Madison attended, and pinned to the raider's chest was a small badge with a seedling symbol, just like the one I'd seen associated with Madison's list. "I think these people might actually have connection to Madison's list," I admitted. "Not the way they claimed, but some connection. I need to find out." In the early morning hours, I slipped out of our hiding place. The compound was eerily quiet, with guards posted at strategic points. I used the irrigation ditches for cover, moving slowly toward the greenhouse complex. The main building was illuminated by portable lights the raiders had set up. 2 guards stood at the entrance, but they were facing outward, watching for threats from outside rather than movement within the compound. I circled around to the back, where a ventilation panel could be removed. In the dim light, I could see shapes moving inside the greenhouse. Raiders examining our growing systems, inspecting the seedlings we'd worked so hard to cultivate. I waited for the patrol pattern to create an opening, then slipped inside through the ventilation panel. Staying in the shadows, I made my way to the workbench where my hidden seed cache was concealed. As I reached beneath the bench to access the hidden compartment, a voice behind me said, "I wouldn't do that if I were you." I turned slowly to find myself facing a young woman holding a pistol. She wore a tactical vest over civilian clothes and had the confident posture of someone used to command. "You're the agriculture expert," she said, "the one who designed these growing systems." I nodded cautiously. "Impressive work. Far more sophisticated than other operations we've taken." She gestured with the gun. "What's under the bench?" "Nutrient solution components," I lied. "Calcium nitrate, magnesium sulfate. Technical supplies." She studied me for a moment. "You're lying. We already found those in the storage cabinet." She stepped closer. "You hid something valuable here. Seeds, I'm guessing. The real prize." She was too close to the truth. I needed to redirect her. "I'm looking for information about Madison's list. One of your people was wearing their symbol." Something changed in her expression. "Where did you hear that name?" "I'm trying to find my daughter. Her name is Madison Wainwright. She was at the University of Washington when all this started. Environmental science program. The woman lowered her gun slightly. Madison Wainwright. The seed cataloger? My heart nearly stopped. You know her? Not personally. But her database system is what we use to track viable agricultural resources. The Madison Protocol, they're calling it now. Classification of seed types, growing conditions, contamination resistance. My Madison. Alive, at least when this system was created. Using her knowledge to help in the crisis. Pride and fear mingled in my chest. Where is she now? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The woman raised her gun again. Information has value in this world, more than you can afford right now. She gestured toward the hidden compartment. Open it, slowly. I had no choice. I removed the false bottom of the workbench, revealing dozens of carefully labeled seed packets. She whistled softly. Heritage varieties, pre-contamination stock. She keyed a radio at her shoulder. Commander, we have a significant find in the greenhouse. Primary target acquired. Primary target. That's when I understood. They hadn't come for the apples or the growing facilities. They'd come for the seeds. For my knowledge. You knew about my collection, I said. How? We monitor radio communications. Your community hasn't been as careful as they should be. She smiled thinly. And Madison's list includes profiles of high-value individuals with agricultural expertise. You've been flagged, Mr. Wainwright. Your reputation preceded you. The commander arrived minutes later, a tall man with a military bearing. He examined the seed collection, asking detailed questions about each variety. His knowledge was substantial. Not a common raider, but someone with scientific background. You understand what you've created here, he said, gesturing to the greenhouse systems. A sustainable food source independent of contaminated soil. Combined with these genetics, we could expand operations significantly. These people welcomed me, I said. They shared what they had. And you murdered them for it. Sentimentality is a luxury, he replied coldly. We're securing humanity's future. Those who can contribute will be allowed to join us. The rest are an unsustainable burden. I thought of Eleanor, Ross, the others hiding in the apple storage facility, of the children who had carefully planted seedlings under my guidance, of Madison, somewhere out there, using her knowledge to help rather than harm. I won't help you, I said. The commander shrugged. You will. Eventually. Everyone does when they understand the alternative. He turned to the woman. Secure him in the farmhouse. Post guards. He's valuable, but not irreplaceable. As they led me away, I caught a glimpse of the apple orchard in the moonlight. Trees that had somehow resisted the contamination, bearing fruit in a dying world. I had learned their secret, and now that knowledge might be used to build something terrible rather than healing. But I also had new information. Madison was alive, or had been recently enough to create a classification system for seed types. And if these people knew of her work, they might know where to find her. I would cooperate for now, gain their trust, learn what I could, and when the moment came, I would take back what was mine and find my daughter in this broken world. They kept me isolated in what had been Eleanor's office, a small room in the farmhouse with a cot, a desk, and a window that had been boarded up from the outside. 2 guards rotated shifts at the door. 3 meals a day, delivered silently. Clean water, even paper and pencils for me to draw up greenhouse plans, which I did reluctantly. The commander, who I learned was called Briggs, visited each morning with the same routine. He would place a map on the desk, point to different locations, and ask about soil conditions, growing seasons, contamination reports. I gave him just enough information to maintain my value while learning what I could about his operation. The harvesters aren't just raiders, he explained on the third day. We're securing agricultural knowledge and resources before they're lost forever. Humanity needs centralized control of food production to survive this crisis. Centralized under your control, I said. He didn't deny it. Someone has to make the hard decisions. Decide who eats and who doesn't. I thought about Stillwater, about the rationing protocols, about Warden Phillips saying almost the same thing. Power always consolidates around food when scarcity hits. I'd seen it in the prison microcosm. Now I was watching it happen across the entire country. On the fifth day, the woman who had discovered me in the greenhouse brought a new visitor to my room, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who introduced himself as Dr. Abernathy. "Mr. Wainwright," he said, "I understand you developed a theory about the orchard's resistance to the pathogen. Mycorrhizal fungi networks protecting the root systems?" I nodded cautiously. "Brilliant observation. We've been tracking similar phenomena in other locations. Perennial woody plants with established beneficial fungi seem to have a survival advantage." He spread a folder of papers on the desk. "I'd like to compare notes." Despite myself, I was drawn into the conversation. Abernathy was a real scientist, a plant pathologist who had been working on the dust problem since the beginning. His knowledge was extensive, his questions precise. For a few hours I forgot I was a prisoner, lost in the technical discussion of fungal biology and potential countermeasures. "We have a research facility," he said as he gathered his notes. "More comprehensive than this field operation. Labs, growth chambers, gene sequencing equipment salvaged from university facilities. Your expertise would be invaluable there." "Am I being offered a choice?" I asked. He looked uncomfortable. "Choices are limited for all of us now, but you would have better conditions, more meaningful work." That night, I heard shouting outside. Peering through a crack in the boarded window, I saw Briggs arguing with the woman who had captured me. Her name was Jenna, I'd learned from overheard conversations. "We can't keep taking more territory," she was saying. "We don't have the manpower to hold it." "The Western operation needs these seed varieties," Briggs countered. "Without genetic diversity, they're vulnerable." "So you'll sacrifice our security here for them? After what we lost taking this place?" Their voices faded as they moved away, but I had learned something valuable. The harvesters weren't a single unified group. They had multiple operations, potentially competing interests. Fracture lines I might be able to exploit. On the seventh day, everything changed. I woke to the sound of gunfire, distant at first, then closer. My guard burst into the room. "Against the wall," he ordered, weapon raised. I complied, heart racing. Through the door I could see people running, heard Briggs shouting orders. An attack on the compound. When the guard's radio crackled, I moved. 8 years of prison work had taught me how to handle violent situations. I grabbed his arm, twisted it behind his back, forced him to drop the weapon. A knee to the back of his leg brought him down. I secured his weapon and radio, then zip-tied his hands with his own restraints. "Who's attacking?" I demanded. "The people you were with," he gasped. "They brought reinforcements. Some group called the River Alliance. Eleanor and the others had escaped, found allies, and returned." Hope surged through me as I made my way cautiously through the house, weapon ready. The compound was in chaos. The harvesters had established systematic control, but they hadn't prepared for a coordinated external attack. I counted at least 30 new attackers wearing blue bandanas for identification. They moved with purpose, targeting the harvesters' defensive positions. I needed to reach the greenhouse before either side decided to destroy it in the fighting. The seed collection and growing systems were too valuable to lose. I made it halfway across the compound when Jenna spotted me. She raised her weapon but hesitated when she saw I was armed as well. "The greenhouse will be damaged in the crossfire," I called to her. "Help me secure it." She studied me for a moment, then nodded. We moved together toward the structure using vehicles and walls for cover. Inside, we found Dr. Abernathy frantically gathering seed samples into a case. "The resistance factors," he was muttering. "Can't lose the resistance factors." "Doctor," Jenna said sharply, "we need to go, now." He looked up, startled. "But the specimens, the cultures." "Bring what you can carry," she ordered. "The rest stays." I realized they were planning to flee, abandoning the compound but taking the most valuable biological materials with them. I couldn't let that happen. "Those seeds were entrusted to this community," I said, raising my weapon. "They stay here." Jenna's expression hardened. "You don't understand what's at stake. These genetics could save millions." "Or control them," I countered. "Food isn't just survival. It's power, and I don't trust Briggs with that power." "Briggs is dead," she said flatly. "Sniper got him 10 minutes ago. This operation is falling apart." That changed things. Without Briggs, the Harvester's command structure would be in disarray. But Jenna and Abernathy were still trying to take the seeds. "I can't let you leave with those," I insisted. Abernathy looked between us, clutching his case. "Perhaps a compromise. We take samples, not the entire collection. Enough to continue research, but leaving the bulk for this community." Before I could respond, the greenhouse door burst open. Eleanor stood there with 3 armed members of the River Alliance. Her face was streaked with dirt, a bandage visible under her torn sleeve, but her eyes were fierce. "Thad," she said, relief in her voice. Then she spotted Jenna and Abernathy. "Harvesters, drop your weapons." Jenna slowly placed her gun on the floor. "We're scientists, not fighters," she said. "The samples we're carrying could help develop resistant crop varieties." "So you keep saying," Eleanor replied coldly, "while killing anyone who gets in your way." I stepped between them. "Eleanor, wait. Dr. Abernathy has legitimate research, information that could help us understand the contamination." She looked at me in disbelief. "They murdered our people, Thad." "I know, but this is bigger than revenge." I turned to Abernathy. "Tell her what you told me about the fungal resistance factors." Reluctantly, he explained his findings, the patterns of resistance, the potential for developing counteragents to the pathogen. As he spoke, I could see Eleanor's expression shifting from outright hostility to cautious interest. "We need to verify this," she said finally. "Miguel can," I suggested. "He has the background to understand the research." While Eleanor's people secured Jenna and Abernathy, I helped Miguel review the scientific data. His assessment confirmed what I'd suspected. The research was valuable, perhaps essential to long-term survival. By nightfall, the compound was back under the community's control. 17 harvesters had been killed in the fighting, the rest captured or fled. The River Alliance, a coalition of communities along the nearby river system, had provided crucial support in the counterattack. Their leader, a former National Guard officer named Reyes, met with us in the farmhouse. "We've been tracking the harvesters for months," he explained. "They've taken 3 other agricultural communities that we know of. This is the first time we've been able to retake one." Eleanor introduced me, explaining my role in establishing the greenhouse systems. He also managed to preserve most of our seed bank during the occupation. Reyes studied me with interest. "We could use someone with your skills in our communities." "I'm trying to reach my daughter," I explained. "She may be connected to something called Madison's List." His expression changed. "The seed registry?" "We've heard of it. some kind of database tracking uncontaminated seed stocks and growing environments, supposedly headquartered somewhere in the Northwest. Hope surged through me. That's her, Madison Wainwright. She was at the University of Washington when all this started. Can't say I've heard the name specifically, but our communications network might be able to help. We maintain radio contact with communities as far west as Idaho. The next morning, I faced a difficult decision. The Orchard community was rebuilding, reinforcing their defenses with help from the River Alliance. They needed my expertise to restore and expand the greenhouse operations. But every day I stayed was another day away from finding Madison. Eleanor found me in the greenhouse, replanting seedlings that had been damaged in the fighting. "You're leaving, aren't you?" I nodded. "I have to find her." "I understand." She handed me a folded map. Reyes marked the River Alliance communities. They'll help you travel safely as far as their territory extends. "What about Jenna and Abernathy?" Eleanor sighed. "The council voted to let them continue their research here, under supervision. Their knowledge is too valuable to lose, despite what they've done. And the seed collection? Distributed among multiple locations now, no single raid can capture it all." She smiled faintly. "We learned from you." I spent the day preparing for departure. The River Alliance provided me with fuel, supplies, and, most importantly, information. Their radio operators had picked up transmissions mentioning Madison's list, coordinates suggesting it was operating somewhere in western Montana or northern Idaho. That evening, I convened a final meeting with Miguel, Claire, and the other greenhouse workers. I walked them through everything I knew about maintaining the systems, troubleshooting problems, propagating new plants from the seed stock. "Remember, diversity is your strength," I told them. "Don't focus on just high-yield crops. Maintain the medicinals, the soil builders, even the flowers for pollinator support." Claire, who had taken over educational programs for the community's children, presented me with a gift. A hand-bound book in which the children had drawn pictures of plants, copying the scientific names and growing requirements from my notes. "So, you won't forget us," she said, as if I could ever forget this place, these people, this brief moment of hope in a collapsing world. At dawn, I prepared to leave. My truck had been recovered after the fighting, repaired and refueled. The River Alliance had provided me with a hand-cranked radio tuned to their emergency frequency and a series of recognition codes that would identify me as a friend to their communities. Eleanor walked me to the gate. "What will you do if you can't find her?" I'd asked myself the same question many times. Keep looking, as long as it takes. And if you do find her, bring her back to somewhere like this, a place trying to build something new rather than just surviving the end of the old world. I looked back at the greenhouse gleaming in the early morning light. "She'd like what you're doing here." Eleanor hugged me, something she'd never done before. "Be careful out there. The harvesters aren't the only organized group taking advantage of the chaos." "I will." I started the truck's engine. "Keep an apple tree growing for me." As I drove through the gate, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the orchard receding behind me. A community that had welcomed me, lost me, and fought to recover not just their home, but their vision of the future. I had helped them build something lasting, something that might survive even as the dust storms continued to ravage the landscape. But now I had new information, new hope of finding Madison. The coordinates from the River Alliance radio operators pointed to a region near the Idaho-Montana border. Mountainous terrain, remote, difficult to access. A logical place to establish a seed bank and research facility away from population centers. I checked the pouch sewn inside my jacket, where I still carried my most precious seeds. Varieties I hadn't shared, even with the orchard. Insurance for the future, for whenever I found Madison. The weight of them against my chest was a constant reminder of purpose. The road ahead stretched through landscapes I'd never seen before. The dust storms had transformed familiar American scenery into alien terrain. Red-tinged soil, abandoned communities, vehicles left where they had run out of fuel or hope. But there were signs of adaptation, too. Roadside gardens in plastic containers, solar stills capturing clean water, people finding ways to survive despite everything. I thought about what Briggs had said before he died, about centralized control of food production, about making hard decisions. His vision was flawed, not because centralization was inherently wrong, but because it centered power rather than knowledge. Madison's list, from what little I understood, seemed to be taking a different approach. Cataloging, preserving, sharing information rather than hoarding it. That sounded like my daughter. The idealistic environmental science student who had argued with me about open-source agriculture and seed-sharing programs when I still believed in patents and proprietary genetics. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had been right all along. In this new world, our survival depended on sharing knowledge, not controlling it, on cooperation, not domination. As I drove toward the mountains visible on the distant horizon, I felt a strange mix of dread and anticipation. The journey would be dangerous. The harvesters would be looking for me, knowing what I carried. Other groups with their own agendas would present unknown threats, and the dust storms continued to intensify, visible now as massive red clouds that could materialize with little warning. But somewhere ahead was Madison, my daughter, creating something that might help rebuild in the wake of this agricultural apocalypse. I had 30 days of travel behind me, with no idea how many more lay ahead. But for the first time since leaving Stillwater, I had more than just hope. I had direction. The truck rumbled steadily beneath me as I checked the map one more time, confirming my route through the network of River Alliance communities. Each one a potential refuge, each one a step closer to finding Madison. The road curved ahead, disappearing into a landscape that was simultaneously familiar and foreign. America transformed by dust, by hunger, by the collapse of systems we had taken for granted, but also by resilience, by adaptation, by the stubborn refusal to surrender to despair. I drove on, seeds against my heart, Madison's name on my lips like a prayer. Forward, always forward, toward whatever remained of the future. The journey through River Alliance territory was almost too easy. 6 communities spaced a day's drive apart, each one expecting me, each one offering fuel, supplies, and a safe place to sleep. They operated like waypoints in the old Underground Railroad, passing travelers from one safe harbor to the next. At each stop, I shared what I knew about greenhouse systems and mycorrhizal fungi networks in exchange for their hospitality. The last Alliance outpost was a former state park ranger station in western South Dakota. From there, I would be on my own through Wyoming and into Montana. The station's leader, a former park ranger named Holt, spread a map across the table as we ate dinner. "This is as current as we have," she said, tracing routes with her finger. "I-90 is impassable around Gillette. Military blockade. You'll need to go north through the Powder River area." I studied the map, noting areas marked with red X's. Contamination zones? Heavy dust activity. The storms are getting worse, moving in patterns we can't predict. This whole region, she circled a large area of eastern Wyoming, had 3 major storms in the past month. Nothing grows there now. She pointed to another marking, a series of small triangles along certain roads. These are the danger zones, armed groups controlling territory. Some are just desperate communities defending what's left. Others are predatory, raiders, resource harvesters, zealots who think the dust is divine punishment. I thought of Briggs and his harvesters. Any word on a group calling themselves the harvesters operating in this region? Holt's expression darkened. We've heard rumors. They hit a seed bank in Sheridan about 2 weeks ago. Military-style operation. Very few survivors. My stomach tightened. Another seed bank destroyed. Knowledge lost. Lives ended in the name of centralized control. I wondered if Jenna had been there, if she'd escaped from the orchard and rejoined her people. What about Madison's list? Any new information on their location? Holt shook her head. Nothing certain. Our last transmission mentioned a facility near Bozeman, but the message was garbled. Could have been warning us away rather than directing us there. That night, I slept fitfully. Dreams filled with dust storms and Madison's voice calling from somewhere I couldn't reach. I woke before dawn, packed my truck, and prepared to leave the safety of the Alliance network. Holt met me at the gate with final supplies. Extra water containers, a better dust mask, and a shortwave radio. Channel 7 at noon, she said. Alliance broadcast daily with updates on storm patterns and road conditions. Don't transmit unless it's an emergency. Too many people triangulating signals these days. I thanked her and headed northwest, following back roads through increasingly desolate landscape. The Alliance's information proved accurate. I-90 was visible in the distance at one point, a solid line of abandoned vehicles stretching to the horizon, military helicopters occasionally visible patrolling above it. I avoided towns where possible, camping in my truck at night, rationing food and water carefully. Wyoming had never been densely populated, but now it felt truly empty. The few farms I passed were abandoned. Fields turned the rusty color of heavy contamination. On my third day beyond Alliance territory, I encountered the first major dust storm. It appeared on the horizon as a towering wall of reddish-brown, blocking out the sun. I had perhaps 15 minutes before it reached me. I pulled off the road near an abandoned gas station, quickly sealing my truck's vents with the duct tape Holt had provided. I covered myself with a plastic poncho, secured my mask, and waited. When the storm hit, it was like being inside a sand blaster. Wind rocked the truck, dust finding every tiny crack, reducing visibility to nothing. The roar was deafening, the air inside the cab quickly becoming difficult to breathe despite my mask. I closed my eyes and focused on breathing slowly, counting seconds, then minutes. The storm lasted 4 hours. When it finally passed, my truck was half buried in reddish dust. The world outside looked alien, familiar shapes transformed by smooth drifts of fine particles. I waited another hour before venturing out, covered head to toe in protective clothing. The gas station building had partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated dust from previous storms. Carefully, I checked inside for anything useful. The shelves had been picked clean long ago. But in the back office, I found a map more recent than mine and, miraculously, a sealed case of water bottles overlooked by earlier scavengers. Back on the road, I made slower progress. Drifts covered sections of pavement, forcing detours through open country. My fuel gauge dipped lower than I liked, and I began calculating whether I had enough to reach Sheridan, where Holt had marked a potential refueling point. As sunset approached, I spotted a structure in the distance that made me slow down. A small school or church building, its white steeple still visible above dust-covered grounds. What caught my attention was the greenhouse attached to its side, plastic sheeting gleaming in the late sunlight. Someone was trying to grow food here, in the middle of nowhere. I approached cautiously, circling the property once to check for signs of danger. No vehicles visible, no movement, no obvious traps. Still, I parked a safe distance away and approached on foot, rifle ready. The building turned out to be a rural community center. Its doors were secured with a chain and padlock that looked relatively new. The greenhouse was primitive but functional, a plastic-covered frame with a series of hydroponic growing trays inside. Through the transparent walls, I could see leafy greens and what looked like tomato plants. I was debating whether to try the door when a voice behind me said, "That's far enough." I turned slowly, hands visible, to find an elderly man pointing a shotgun at me. He wore a dust mask, pushed up on his forehead, and carried a basket of what looked like recently harvested lettuce. "I'm not looking for trouble," I said, "just passing through." He studied me, noting my vehicle in the distance, the careful way I'd approached. "Where you headed?" "Montana, looking for my daughter." Something in his expression softened slightly. "You've got that look. Seen it before. Parent searching for a child in all this mess?" He lowered the shotgun a fraction. "You know anything about hydroponics?" The question surprised me. "Actually, yes. I ran an agricultural program at Stillwater Correctional before all this happened." He raised his eyebrows. "Prison farm program? Well, that's a stroke of luck. Got a water pump that's giving me fits. Fix it, you can stay the night. A safe place to sleep is worth something these days." His name was Walter Davis, former high school science teacher who'd retired to this rural community to be near his grandchildren. When the dust crisis hit, his family had evacuated to a FEMA camp in North Dakota, but he'd stayed behind. "Someone needed to maintain the growing systems," he explained as he showed me the malfunctioning pump. "Knowledge gets lost otherwise. Plants die, seeds lost." He'd converted the community center into a combination living space and agricultural experiment station. The main room was filled with growing trays under salvaged grow lights. Seed packets were carefully organized in file cabinets. Notes and observations covered one entire wall, a detailed record of what worked and what didn't in this new world. "Found the problem," I told him, examining the pump. "Intake filters clogged with mineral deposits. Your water source must be high in calcium." We worked together to clean and repair the pump, then checked the nutrient levels in his hydroponic system. I shared what I'd learned about beneficial fungi at the orchard, while he told me about his experiments with UV light exposure to reduce pathogen growth. Over a dinner of fresh greens and reconstituted protein, I asked him about Madison's List. "Heard of it," he nodded. "Never made contact myself, but travelers bring stories. Some kind of network cataloging uncontaminated seed varieties and growing environments. Supposedly, they've got research facilities working on resistant plant strains." "Any idea where they're headquartered?" He considered this while chewing. "Talk points to the mountains. Higher elevations seem to slow the spread of the dust. Less agricultural land to begin with, so less contamination." He took a sip of water. "Heard rumors about a place near Bozeman. Former agricultural research station converted into some kind of seed ark." Another reference to Bozeman. The pieces were starting to align. "You planning to head there?" Walter asked. "If I can find it. My daughter was studying environmental science at the University of Washington. I think she might be involved with this group." He nodded thoughtfully. "Road through Sheridan used to be clear, but I've had no news from there in weeks. Last trader who came through said something bad happened. Wouldn't elaborate. The harvester's attack on the seed bank, most likely." I decided not to mention them to Walter. No sense burdening him with another worry. In the morning, Walter helped me clean my truck's air filter and provided me with fresh greens from his greenhouse. In return, I gave him one of my precious seed packets, drought-resistant tomatoes that could thrive in his system. "If anyone else comes through," I said, "tell them Thad Wainwright says the prison agricultural method works. Johnson will understand." Who's Johnson? Someone who might be looking for safe places. A good man. Walter nodded, understanding my meaning. I'll remember. Back on the road, I bypassed Sheridan entirely based on Walter's warning, taking a longer route that added a day to my journey, but might be safer. The landscape became more rugged as I approached the Montana border, the plains giving way to hills and eventually mountains. Here, the contamination was visibly less severe. Patches of native grasses still grew in sheltered valleys. I even spotted wildlife occasionally, deer moving through underbrush, hawks circling overhead. Near a small border town, I encountered a roadblock that wasn't on any of my maps. 3 vehicles parked across the highway, armed figures visible behind them. Not military from what I could see. Locals protecting their territory or something more organized. I stopped well back from the barrier and studied it through binoculars. The guards wore no consistent uniform, carried a mix of weapons. One vehicle had Border Patrol hand-painted on its side, though this was nowhere near an international border. I could try to bypass them cross-country, but the terrain was difficult, and my truck wasn't built for off-roading. I might get stuck, or waste precious fuel. Better to approach cautiously and assess the situation. As I drove slowly toward the checkpoint, I kept my hands visible on the steering wheel. A woman with a rifle approached my window, gesturing for me to stop and roll it down. "Where are you coming from?" she asked, eyes scanning my vehicle, noting the dust coating, the supplies visible inside. "South Dakota, heading to Bozeman if the roads are clear. Purpose? Looking for my daughter. She might be with a group called Madison's List." Her expression changed slightly at the name. "ID?" I reached slowly for my wallet, producing my old Stillwater Correctional Staff badge. It was nearly worthless now, but still marked me as someone who had once been part of the system. She examined it, then handed it back. "Pull over there. Need to check something." She spoke briefly with the others at the barricade, then disappeared into one of the vehicles where I could see radio equipment. Minutes passed. I waited, engine idling, ready to accelerate away if things went bad. Finally, she returned with an older man who studied me carefully through the window. "You said Madison's List," he stated. "You have verification?" "Verification of what?" "That you're cleared to know about them. They're not exactly advertising their location these days." I chose my words carefully. "My daughter is Madison Wainwright, environmental science student from the University of Washington. I believe she helped create their seed classification system, the Madison Protocol." The man's eyes widened slightly. He conferred with the woman in hushed tones, then turned back to me. "Wait here." An hour passed. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the checkpoint. I sipped water sparingly, watching as vehicles were turned away in both directions. Whatever this group was, they were serious about controlling movement through their territory. Finally, the man returned with a sealed envelope. "Take this to the ranger station at Canyon Ferry Lake. Someone there will verify your identity and provide further instructions. Do not attempt to deviate from the main road. We have patrols." I accepted the envelope, noting it was sealed with wax, impressed with what looked like a seedling symbol. "The Madison Protocol is real?" I asked. He nodded once. "Very. And very important. If you're who you claim to be, they'll want to talk to you." His expression hardened. "If you're not, they'll know." The barricade was moved aside, and I continued into Montana, the sealed envelope on the seat beside me like a golden ticket. The road improved as I drove, evidence of maintenance, of organized society still functioning in some capacity. I reached Canyon Ferry Lake by late afternoon. The ranger station was clearly occupied. Solar panels on the roof, a small garden plot visible behind a protective fence. 2 guards stopped me at the entrance, examined the sealed envelope, then escorted me inside. A woman in her 30s met me in what had once been the visitor center. She wore practical outdoor clothing and had the confident bearing of someone used to authority. "I'm Dr. Rivas," she said, not offering to shake hands. "You claim to be Madison Wainwright's father?" "I am. Thaddeus Wainwright. I ran the agricultural program at Stillwater Correctional in Minnesota." She gestured to a chair across from her desk. "We'll need to verify that. We've had infiltration attempts before from groups seeking our research." "The harvesters?" Her expression turned guarded. "Among others." "What do you know about them?" "They attacked a community I was staying with, took control of our greenhouse operation. Their leader, Briggs, was killed in a counterattack." She made notes on a tablet. "And how did you learn about Madison's list?" "Signs along the road, rumors from travelers, and I heard about the Madison Protocol from one of the harvesters, a woman named Jenna." Dr. Rivas typed something else, then looked up at me. "We'll need to hold you here while we verify your identity. It will take at least a day to receive confirmation." "Is Madison here? At this facility?" "I'm not authorized to provide that information. But she's alive? She's safe?" Dr. Rivas's expression softened slightly. "The creator of the Madison Protocol is alive and continuing her work. That's all I can tell you for now." I was shown to a small cabin where I would stay while they verified my story. The door wasn't locked, but a guard was posted outside. Not quite a prisoner, not quite a guest. As the sun set over the lake, I sat on the cabin's porch, watching a massive dust storm in the distance, a red wall moving along the plains, but not reaching the higher elevation where we were. I thought about Walter and his greenhouse, about Eleanor and the orchard community, about Johnson somewhere out there using what I'd taught him to survive. All those seeds I'd carried, both literal and metaphorical, planted along my journey. And now, possibly, the most important seed of all, the hope that Madison was alive, was safe, was using her knowledge to help rebuild rather than control. Tomorrow I might learn whether I had finally reached the end of my journey, or just another waypoint. But for tonight, watching the dust storm that couldn't reach us, I allowed myself to feel something I'd almost forgotten. Peace. They kept me waiting for 3 days. Each morning, Dr. Rivas would visit my cabin, ask more questions about my journey, my work at Stillwater, my knowledge of agricultural systems. Each evening, she would leave with a non-committal, "We're still verifying," and I would spend another night watching dust storms in the distance, wondering if I was any closer to finding Madison. The facility at Canyon Ferry Lake was more extensive than it first appeared. Beyond the ranger station and cabins visible from the entrance, a small community had been established. Solar arrays powered greenhouses and research buildings. A former camping area had been converted to gardens with raised beds inside protective bubble structures. People moved with purpose between buildings, carrying equipment, tending plants, maintaining security patrols. On the 4th morning, Dr. Rivas arrived with a different expression. "We've received confirmation of your identity," she said, "and we've made contact with our research station near Bozeman. They're sending transport for you." "Is Madison there?" I asked, the question that had been burning in me for days. Dr. Rivas hesitated. "Madison Wainwright established the protocol our network uses, yes, but I can't tell you more. Security protocols." I was escorted to a garage where a modified SUV waited, its engine running. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside. Dr. Rivas handed me a small bag containing my personal items they had examined. "Your vehicle and remaining supplies will be kept here," she said. "If everything checks out, they'll be forwarded to you." The driver's window lowered slightly and a voice said, "We need to move." storm front approaching from the west. I climbed into the passenger seat, finding myself next to a man in his 30s with the watchful eyes of former military. He nodded once but didn't introduce himself, immediately putting the vehicle in gear and heading out. "I'm Thad Wainwright," I said as we drove away from the ranger station. "I know who you are." His tone wasn't hostile, just matter of fact. "I'm Davis, security lead at the facility." We drove in silence for nearly an hour, following roads that wouldn't have appeared on any tourist map. Davis clearly knew the terrain well, navigating around washouts and debris with practiced ease. Twice we stopped while he checked readings on a handheld device, altering our course slightly each time. "Dust monitors," he explained briefly. "We track storm movements, maintain a network of sensors throughout the region." Finally, I couldn't contain my questions any longer. "The Madison Protocol. What exactly is it?" Davis glanced at me, then back to the road. "Classification system for seed varieties and growing environments based on contamination resistance. Changed everything about how we approach agriculture in the dust zones." "And Madison created this?" "The framework, yes. Others have contributed, expanded it. It's the foundation of everything we do." As we climbed higher into the mountains, the landscape changed. Less dust, more vegetation. Streams running clear, rather than tinged with reddish sediment. Signs of the world before, preserved at these elevations. We rounded a bend and a complex of buildings came into view, nestled in a protected valley. The main structure was a large, modern research facility surrounded by greenhouse domes and agricultural test plots. Solar arrays and wind turbines dotted the hillsides. A perimeter fence with guard towers enclosed the entire area. Davis stopped at a security checkpoint where armed personnel examined credentials and inspected the vehicle. After radio confirmation, the gate swung open, and we drove into the compound. "Welcome to the Seed Ark," Davis said, the first hint of pride in his voice. Inside, the facility hummed with activity. Dozens of people moved between buildings, some in lab coats, others in work clothes. Greenhouses glowed with grow lights despite the natural sunlight outside. The central building featured large windows looking into laboratory spaces where people worked at benches and computer stations. Davis parked near the main entrance and led me inside. The temperature-controlled interior felt strange after weeks on the road. Clean, regulated, almost like the world before the dust. Staff members nodded to Davis as we passed, eyeing me with curiosity. We entered a conference room where 3 people waited. A gray-haired man in his 60s introduced himself as Dr. Emerson, the facility director. Beside him sat a younger woman with a tablet who was introduced only as Coordinator Chen. The third person, a man about my age with a weathered face and practical clothing, wasn't introduced at all. "Mr. Wainwright," Dr. Emerson began, "your journey to find us has been quite remarkable. Not many people have traveled as far as you have since the crisis began." "I was looking for my daughter," I said simply. Emerson exchanged glances with the others. "Yes, Madison Wainwright. Her work forms the cornerstone of our efforts here." "Is she here?" I asked, my patience finally exhausted. "Please, just tell me if she's alive, if she's safe." The unnamed man spoke for the first time. "Madison established the protocol framework at the University of Washington in the early days of the crisis. When the West Coast quarantine measures failed, she led a team transporting their seed bank and research to this facility." My heart raced. She had been here. 3 months ago, he continued, she left with a research team to verify reports of naturally resistant plant varieties in isolated communities. Their last confirmed location was in northern Idaho. The hope that had been building crashed down around me. "She's missing?" "Not missing," Coordinator Chen corrected quickly. "Operating in an area with limited communication infrastructure. We receive periodic updates through our courier network." Dr. Emerson leaned forward. Mr. Wainwright, we understand your primary concern is your daughter, but you should know that your arrival here is significant for other reasons. We've received reports about your work with mycorrhizal fungi networks at a community called the Orchard, about your observations regarding their protective effect against the pathogen. So they knew about that. I wondered what else they knew about my journey. The fungi created a barrier around the apple tree roots, I explained, prevented the pathogen from colonizing the root systems. Exactly, Emerson said, excitement creeping into his voice. We've been experimenting with similar approaches, but your field observations provide critical validation. Natural systems developing resistance mechanisms is precisely what the Madison Protocol was designed to identify and catalog. For the next hour, they questioned me about everything I'd observed. The growing systems at Stillwater, the greenhouse operations at the Orchard, Walter's hydroponic setup, the varying intensity of dust storms across different regions. I answered as thoroughly as I could, but my mind kept returning to Madison, somewhere in Idaho, beyond contact. Finally, Dr. Emerson stood. You must be tired after your journey. We've prepared quarters for you in the residential section. Tomorrow, we'd like you to meet with our research team to discuss potential integration of your observations into our current projects. And Madison? I pressed. When is her team expected to return? The unnamed man spoke again. Their mission parameters allowed for up to 6 months in the field. They've been gone for 3. We expect updates through the courier network within the next few weeks. I was shown to a small but comfortable apartment in a building adjacent to the main facility. After weeks of sleeping in my truck or on borrowed cots, the proper bed and private bathroom felt like impossible luxury. I showered, changed into clean clothes provided for me, and tried to process everything I'd learned. Madison was alive. She had created something important, something that might help humanity survive the dust crisis. But she wasn't here. I had traveled across a collapsing country, carrying my precious seed collection, following the trail of her work, only to find I had missed her. A knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. When I opened it, the unnamed man from the meeting stood there, hands in his pockets. "May I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside, curious about this person who seemed to have authority but had barely been acknowledged in the meeting. He looked around the apartment, then sat at the small table by the window. "They didn't tell you everything," he said without preamble. I gathered that. Madison's team is in danger. We lost contact with them 4 weeks ago, not 3 months ago as Chen implied. Their last message indicated they were being pursued by a group with military capabilities. The Harvesters. It had to be. Why tell me this? Because tomorrow they're going to ask you to join the research team here. Integrate your knowledge. Become part of the Seed Arc project. It's important work. He paused. But I thought you deserved to know the truth about Madison first. I studied him more carefully. There was something familiar in his features and the way he held himself. "Who are you?" "James Wainwright. Madison's uncle. Your brother." I stared at him in shock. James, my younger brother who had disappeared into government research 20 years ago. We'd had a falling out over agricultural patents, over the corporatization of food systems. I hadn't spoken to him since before Madison was born. "James, how are you here?" I was working for the USDA Research Division when the crisis began. I recognized the severity before most, started preparations. When Madison's team needed a secure facility with the right infrastructure, I directed them here. He smiled faintly. She didn't know I was her uncle at first. I wasn't sure she'd ever been told about me. "She knew," I said. "I told her about you when she got interested in environmental science. About our disagreements. About your research." James nodded slowly. We had a lot to talk about when she figured it out. She's brilliant, Thad. What she developed with the protocol, it's revolutionized how we approach the crisis. And now, she's missing. Not missing. Radio silent, but moving with purpose. Her last transmission indicated they had found something significant. A plant community with natural resistance on a scale we haven't seen elsewhere. So why isn't there a team looking for them? James looked tired, suddenly. Resources. The Seed Ark is the most important agricultural research facility left in the country, possibly the world. We can't risk personnel on rescue operations when the future of food production hangs in the balance. I felt anger rising in me. She's your niece, and the creator of the system that might save humanity from starvation, he countered. I don't like it either, but the calculations are brutal. The needs of the many versus the few. Then I'll go, I said. Give me the coordinates of their last known location, whatever intelligence you have on the group pursuing them. James shook his head. It's not that simple. The region they're in is highly contaminated. Massive dust storm activity. Special equipment is needed just to navigate, let alone survive. Then give me the equipment. He studied me for a moment. You haven't changed, have you? Still the stubborn older brother? Still putting family first, I corrected. Something you never understood. The barb hit its mark. James stood abruptly. I'll talk to Emerson, see what can be arranged. But I'm not promising anything. The Ark's priorities are bigger than any individual, even Madison. After he left, I stood at the window, looking out at the facility. The greenhouses glowing in the dusk, researchers moving between buildings, the security perimeter with its watchful guards, a fortress of knowledge in a world being consumed by dust. I thought about what I carried with me, not just my physical seed collection, but the network of knowledge and connections I'd built on my journey. Johnson and his understanding of prison agricultural systems, Eleanor and the community at the orchard, with their mycorrhizal fungi discovery, Walter with his hydroponic innovations, all these seeds I'd gathered and planted along the way. Madison had done something similar but on a larger scale. The protocol, a system for sharing and building knowledge when the old information networks were failing. Like father, like daughter. The next morning, I met with the research team as planned. Scientists and agricultural specialists questioned me about everything I'd seen and learned, particularly interested in the mycorrhizal fungi network at the orchard. I shared freely, drawing diagrams, explaining the systems we'd built, the patterns of resistance I'd observed. Dr. Emerson seemed pleased. This confirms several of our theoretical models, he told the group. Mr. Wainwright's field observations provide valuable validation of the symbiotic resistance hypothesis. After the meeting, James approached me. I spoke with Emerson about Madison's team. He's agreed to provide you with maps and their last known coordinates, but no personnel or vehicles can be spared. I'll need supplies, equipment for dealing with the dust storms. I'll see what I can arrange. He hesitated. Thad, you should know what you're getting into. The group pursuing Madison's team. We believe they're the same ones who attacked the seed bank in Sheridan. Heavily armed, well organized. Former military contractors who've decided that controlling food production means controlling the future. The harvesters, I said. I've encountered them before. James looked surprised. You know about them. They took over the orchard while I was there. Their leader, Briggs, talked about centralizing agricultural control, about making the hard decisions about who eats and who doesn't. Briggs is dead? Killed during a counterattack by a group called the River Alliance. James made notes on a tablet. This is valuable intelligence. We've been tracking harvester movements but had limited information on their leadership structure. They had a scientist with them, I added. Dr. Abernathy, and a woman named Jenna, who seemed to be second in command. Abernathy, James repeated. Former CDC pathologist. He disappeared from a research facility in Atlanta early in the crisis, taking samples and data with him. He looked troubled. If he's working with the harvesters, the situation is worse than we thought. He has the knowledge to weaponize the pathogen, potentially target resistant varieties. The implications were chilling. Not just controlling food production, but potentially destroying anyone else's ability to grow food at all. I need to find Madison, I said, not just because she's my daughter, but because her team may be the target of people who want to control the future of agriculture, who want to control who lives and who dies. James nodded slowly. I'll get you what you need. But Thad, be prepared. The world out there, it's not like anything we grew up with. The rules have changed. Survival often means making compromises we never thought we would. Some things don't change, I told him. Family, knowledge, sharing rather than hoarding. The seeds that will rebuild, not just control. That evening, I stood on the small balcony of my apartment, watching researchers tending the experimental plots as the sun set behind the mountains. Madison had been here, had walked these paths, had created something that gave people hope in a world choking on dust. I would find her. I would bring her back to this place where her work could continue. Or, if that wasn't possible, I would help her complete whatever mission had taken her into the contaminated zones of Idaho. Either way, I wouldn't stop until I knew she was safe. The seed collection I'd carried across the country was now secured in the Ark's vault, cataloged according to the Madison Protocol. All except one variety, a rare drought-resistant wheat that I kept in an inner pocket of my jacket. Insurance, perhaps. Or just a father's stubborn belief that he would someday share it with his daughter. Tomorrow, I would begin preparations for the next leg of my journey. Maps to study, equipment to gather, intelligence to review. The search for Madison would take me into the most heavily contaminated regions, facing not just the threat of dust storms, but the organized danger of the harvesters. My 30 days on the road had stretched to many more, but I was closer now than I had ever been. Madison was out there, carrying forward her vision of a world where knowledge was shared, where food could grow again, where humanity had a future beyond the dust, and I was coming to find her. The Seed Ark gave me 3 days to prepare for my journey into Idaho. I spent them studying maps, memorizing terrain features, learning to use the specialized equipment they provided, a respirator system designed for extended dust exposure, goggles with filtration seals, a satellite communication device that might work in the mountains, though connection would be spotty at best. James had secured me a reinforced all-terrain vehicle with dust filtration systems for the engine and cabin. The range was limited, fuel efficiency sacrificed for durability, but it would get me to the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains where Madison's team was last known to be operating. Their mission was to verify reports of naturally resistant plant communities in isolated valleys, James explained as we reviewed the mission details. Areas that were remote even before the crisis, accessible only by Forest Service roads that may no longer be passable. Why these specific locations? I asked, studying the marked areas on the map. Isolation, primarily. Communities that had minimal contact with industrial agriculture, that maintained heirloom seed stocks, that practiced traditional growing methods. He pointed to one valley in particular. This area was home to a group that rejected modern agricultural practices entirely. They maintained seed lines stretching back generations, unmodified by commercial breeding programs. The kind of people I would have dismissed as backward before the crisis. Now they might hold the key to humanity's future. Dr. Emerson added one final component to my supplies, a portable DNA sequencer and sample collection kit. If you find resistant varieties, we need genetic material, he explained. The sequencer can do preliminary analysis in the field, identify potentially valuable mutations. The night before my departure, I sat with James in the facility's small cafeteria, both of us nursing cups of tea, a luxury provided by one of the Ark's experimental herb gardens. Madison changed after she got here, he said quietly. Became more focused, more driven. The protocol started as an academic exercise, a classification system for her university work. Here, it evolved into something more comprehensive. She always cared about food security, I said, even as a teenager. I remember her science fair project on urban vertical farming. She was furious when the judges gave first place to a model rocket instead. James smiled. She told me about that. Said it was the moment she realized most people didn't understand how fragile our food systems were. And I was one of those people, I admitted. I worked in agricultural systems, but I never saw the bigger picture the way she did. She's proud of you, you know. Talked about your prison program, how you were teaching sustainable methods to people society had thrown away. The simple statement hit me like a physical blow. Madison had been proud of me. Even during our estrangement, even when we barely spoke, she had valued what I was doing. I need to find her, James. Not just because she's important to the Ark's work, because I need to tell her I understand now. I see what she was trying to do all along. He nodded slowly. If anyone can find her, it's you. You've survived when most wouldn't have made it half as far. He pulled something from his pocket and slid it across the table. Take this. It belonged to Madison. It was a small flash drive on a chain, the kind people used to wear as necklaces. What's on it? Her original notes on the protocol. Personal reflections. Things she didn't include in the official documentation. He looked away. She gave it to me before she left. Said if anything happened to her, the information should be preserved. I closed my hand around it, feeling the hard edges press into my palm. Another piece of Madison, another seed to carry. At dawn, I prepared to leave. The Ark's staff had loaded my vehicle with supplies sufficient for 3 weeks in the field. Water, rations, medical supplies, spare parts for the filtration systems. A team of researchers provided last-minute instructions on using the DNA sequencer. Security personnel briefed me on known harvester movement patterns in the region. James met me at the main gate. The facility at Canyon Ferry Lake will remain your emergency contact point, he said. If you need extraction, if you find Madison, if you locate significant botanical samples, that's where you call. I nodded, checking the satellite communicator one last time. Thad, James said, his voice lower, there's something else you should know. Something Emerson didn't authorize me to tell you. I waited, sensing the importance of whatever he was about to say. Madison's team wasn't just looking for resistant plant varieties. They were testing a theory about the pathogen itself, about its origins. Its origins? I thought it was a natural soil fungus that mutated. James glanced around, ensuring no one was within earshot. That's the official position. But Madison found inconsistencies in the genetic structure, patterns that suggested it might not be entirely natural. You're saying it was engineered, released deliberately. Not necessarily released deliberately, but perhaps a modified organism that escaped containment. Either way, if she's right, understanding the original structure could be key to developing a counter-agent. The implications were staggering. Not just adapting to the dust, but potentially neutralizing it, reclaiming contaminated land, rebuilding agricultural systems on a scale that might feed millions rather than isolated communities. Why keep this secret? I asked. Hope can be dangerous, James replied. If people learned there might be a way to end the crisis, but then we failed to develop it, the psychological impact could be devastating. Better to under-promise and over-deliver. I thought about this as I drove away from the Sea Ark, watching it recede in my rearview mirror. The greatest repository of agricultural knowledge left in the country, perhaps the world. A fortress protecting humanity's future. And somewhere beyond it, Madison was pursuing an even more audacious goal. Not just adaptation, but reversal. The journey into Idaho took me through increasingly devastated landscapes. Towns abandoned, fields barren, forests dying as the pathogen moved from soil into the root systems of trees. I passed military checkpoints that had been abandoned, their barriers still in place but no one remaining to monitor them. The government's presence had contracted, focusing on defending core territories while leaving the periphery to fend for itself. I skirted the remains of larger communities, having learned that urban areas were now danger zones where desperate survivors fought over dwindling resources. Instead, I followed Forest Service roads into the mountains, climbing away from the worst contamination zones into terrain where the air was clearer and vegetation still survived in protected valleys. On my fourth day, I encountered the first sign of Madison's team. A research station established in what had once been a fire lookout tower, now repurposed with solar panels and communication equipment. The facility was abandoned, but showed signs of recent use. Sample containers labeled with the Madison Protocol classification system. Notes written in a hand I recognized from childhood. Neat, precise letters documenting observations about local plant communities. I searched the station thoroughly, looking for any indication of where they had gone next. In a locked cabinet, I found a field journal with entries dating to 6 weeks earlier. The final entry read, "Moving to Site C tomorrow. Local informant reports unusual growth patterns in North Valley. Possible natural resistance or previously unknown symbiotic relationship." A map attached to the journal showed Site C in a remote valley 10 miles deeper into the mountains. I calculated I could reach it in a day if the roads remained passable. That night, I made camp in the lookout tower, using my satellite communicator to update Canyon Ferry Lake on my progress. The response was brief. Acknowledged. Weather alert. Dust front moving north from Salmon River region. Estimated arrival your position 36 hours. Proceed with caution. I studied the atmospheric data they transmitted. A massive dust storm system moving up from the south, larger than any I'd seen before. If I didn't reach Site C and locate Madison's team before it hit, I might be stranded for days, or worse, caught in the open when visibility dropped to 0. At first light, I pushed deeper into the mountains, following logging roads that hadn't been maintained since before the crisis. Twice I had to clear fallen trees from the path. Once I nearly lost the vehicle in a washout that had taken half the road with it. But by mid-afternoon, I reached the coordinates for Site C. It was a valley sheltered by steep mountains on 3 sides, a natural fortress against dust storms and human intrusion alike. At its center stood a cluster of buildings that looked like they predated the crisis by decades. A main lodge constructed of massive logs, several smaller cabins, outbuildings, and most importantly, cultivated fields. Someone was growing food here. Rows of crops stretching across the valley floor, green and vibrant despite the contamination that had devastated agriculture elsewhere. As I drove closer, I could make out people working in the fields. Not hazard suits or protective gear, but ordinary clothing. They moved with purpose, tending plants with hand tools, carrying baskets of harvested produce. I stopped at the edge of the property, not wanting to alarm them with an unknown vehicle. Through binoculars, I studied the operation more carefully. The growing methods were unlike anything I'd seen since before the crisis. No plastic sheeting, no isolation chambers, no filtration systems, just open fields with healthy crops growing directly in the soil. As I watched, a figure separated from the others and approached my position. A woman in her 40s wearing practical work clothes and carrying a rifle across her body in a casual but ready position. I stepped out of my vehicle, hands visible, removing my respirator mask as a sign of trust. "You're from the research team?" she called when she was within speaking distance. "I'm looking for them," I replied. "For Madison Wainwright in particular." She studied me carefully, taking in my vehicle, my seed arc equipment, my face. "You're her father," she said finally. Not a question, but a statement of recognition. I nodded, heart suddenly racing. "She's here?" She was. Left 3 days ago with 2 of her colleagues, heading for the old mining complex in the next valley. The woman shouldered her rifle. "I'm Sarah Blackwood. This is my community. Your daughter helped us understand why our crops survive when others don't." "And why is that?" I asked, looking at the impossibly healthy fields behind her. "Volcanic soil composition, indigenous growing techniques, companion planting methods that support beneficial microorganisms, multiple factors working together." She gestured toward the main lodge. "Come inside. I'll show you her findings." The lodge was a community center for about 30 people who had lived in this remote valley for generations. They had maintained traditional agricultural practices, refusing modern chemical inputs, preserving heritage seed varieties, practicing what they called relationship farming, understanding the connections between soil, plants, insects, and climate. Sarah showed me Madison's research station in what had once been a game room. Sample containers, microscopes, a field version of the DNA sequencer I carried, all neatly organized with labeled specimens and detailed notes. She was excited about something she found in our soil microbiome, Sarah explained. A fungal species that seemed to prevent the pathogen from establishing itself. But she needed more samples, different growing conditions to test her theory. "The mining complex she went to? Is it far?" I asked. "Half a day's hike, no vehicle access. The old roads washed out years ago." I checked my atmospheric data again. The dust front was moving faster than predicted, now less than 24 hours from reaching us. "I need to find her before that storm hits." Sarah nodded grimly. "We've been tracking it too. Our weather station shows it's intensifying. You can leave your vehicle here, take the eastern trail along the ridge. If you start at dawn, you might reach the mining complex by midday." That night, I studied Madison's notes, marveling at the precision of her observations, the leaps of intuition that connected seemingly unrelated data points. She'd identified 3 separate mechanisms that might contribute to pathogen resistance: a previously unknown fungal species that competed directly with the dust pathogen, a soil mineral composition that inhibited spore germination, and plant varieties with enhanced immune responses. But what caught my attention was a section labeled Origin Hypothesis. Here, Madison had mapped out a theory about the pathogen's creation, not a natural mutation as officially claimed, but a genetically modified organism designed for agricultural application that had undergone unexpected recombination in the wild. If she was right, the implications were profound. A designed organism would have specific weaknesses coded into its structure, fail-safes intended to prevent exactly the kind of runaway spread that had occurred. Finding those weaknesses might be the key to stopping the dust apocalypse rather than merely surviving it. At dawn, I set out with supplies for 3 days, following Sarah's directions along the ridge trail. The path was steep but well maintained, climbing quickly above the valley floor. From the higher elevation, I could see the dust front approaching from the south, a massive wall of reddish-brown that obscured the horizon. The mining complex came into view around midday, just as Sarah had predicted. An abandoned operation with rusted equipment, collapsing outbuildings, and a main structure that had been repurposed with new solar panels and equipment. Madison's research outpost. As I approached, I saw no signs of activity. No movement, no smoke from chimneys, nothing to indicate anyone was there, but the equipment looked recently used, not yet covered in the dust that settled on everything in this new world. "Madison?" I called as I neared the main building. "Madison, it's Dad." No response, just mountain silence and the distant sound of the wind picking up as the storm front approached. The door to the main building was secured, but not locked. Inside, I found another research station similar to the one in the valley, but with signs of hasty departure. Equipment cases left open, notes scattered, food half prepared in the small kitchen area. On a central workbench, I found Madison's field journal. The last entry, dated 3 days earlier, read, "Breakthrough confirmed. Compound M37 shows 94% inhibition of pathogen growth in lab conditions. Moving to field test site to verify soil application efficacy. Will return for remaining equipment within 48 hours." They had found something significant enough to rush to a field test site without properly securing their base camp. I searched for coordinates, maps, any indication of where this test site might be located, but found nothing specific, just a reference to the original containment zone that meant nothing to me. Outside, the wind was picking up noticeably. The storm front had accelerated, now visible as a looming wall of dust that would reach the mining complex within hours, not the next day as predicted. I needed shelter, and I needed it soon. I was securing the building's ventilation system when I heard the sound of an engine, not from the direction of the valley I'd come from, but from further up the mountain. A vehicle approaching on what I had thought was impassable terrain. Grabbing my binoculars, I climbed to the building's roof for a better view. A modified military transport was making its way down an old mining road designed for rugged conditions. Through the dust-filtering lenses, I could make out armed figures in the back. Their uniforms and equipment were unmistakable. Harvesters. They had found Madison's research site just as they had found the seed bank in Sheridan, just as they had found the orchard. And given the timing of Madison's departure and their arrival, they might be following her to the field test site. I had minutes, perhaps, before they reached the complex. Not enough time to hide my presence or set up an effective defense. I grabbed Madison's journal and essential samples, secured them in my pack, and slipped out the back of the building toward a ravine that might provide cover. As I moved away from the complex, staying low and using terrain features for concealment, I heard the harvester vehicle stop. Voices called out commands. They would discover signs of my presence soon enough, realize someone had arrived just before them. The question now was whether they knew where Madison had gone. If they were following her, they might have information I needed. If not, I had to ensure they didn't find what I had. Her journal with notes about the breakthrough compound. The storm front was approaching rapidly, the wind now strong enough to lift dust from the ground around me. Visibility was decreasing by the minute. Soon, the harvesters would have to seek shelter or risk being caught unprotected when the full force of the storm hit. I had a choice to make. Retreat to the valley community with what I'd found, or try to follow Madison to the field test site, wherever it might be. The first option was safer. The second might be the only chance to find her before the harvesters did. As the dust began to swirl around me and the harvesters methodically searched the complex behind me, I made my decision. Madison had discovered something that might not just help people survive the dust apocalypse, but actually end it. She was carrying that knowledge to a place where it could be tested, proven, perhaps implemented. I had to find her, not just as her father, but as someone who understood what was at stake. The seeds I carried, both literally and figuratively, were not just for survival, but for renewal, for a world beyond the dust. I checked my compass, oriented myself toward higher ground where I might find shelter from the approaching storm, and began moving away from the mining complex. Somewhere ahead was Madison, carrying the most valuable seed of all, hope for a world reborn from the ashes of the old. Behind me, the dust storm engulfed the mining complex, hiding it from view. Ahead, the path was unclear, fraught with danger from both nature and human threats. But for the first time since leaving Stillwater Correctional 30 days ago, I felt certain I was close to finding my daughter, and perhaps, in doing so, helping to save what remained of our world.